I still remember the morning it all began. Crisp October air, the smell of damp leaves, and me standing on my driveway, coffee in hand, staring at a strange white SUV inside my garage. I rubbed my eyes, certain I had to be seeing things. But no, it was definitely there. My garage door was wide open, and someone else's vehicle was comfortably nestled inside. I'm not usually the type to jump to conclusions, but right away got the sense this was some kind of bold intrusion. My name is Desmond Gray, 62 years old, retired math teacher, generally calm but absolutely fed up with nonsense. If you have ever had an arrogant neighbor assume they could help themselves to your property, keep reading, because you will want to know how I handled this unexpected violation. It is a story that is part ridiculous, part frustrating, and a whole lot entertaining. Let us back up to where it started. My new neighbor, who goes by Karen, had moved into the neighborhood 2 months prior. She was younger than I am by a couple decades, but from our few interactions, I gathered that she was used to the world revolving around her. I had seen her on occasion, typically talking on her phone, loud enough for half the cul-de-sac to hear. She had bright gold hair, always slicked back into a high ponytail, and a taste for neon leggings that could stop traffic. Each time I tried a friendly greeting, she barely acknowledged me, just a brief nod or a dismissive wave. I figured she was the type who wanted to keep to herself. No harm in that, right? We do not all have to be best friends. Then about a week before I found her car in my garage, I noticed her searching through my recycling bin at the curb. She claimed she was trying to see if the collectors had missed an item of hers that had blown into my yard. She said this with a chuckle, but her eyes were scanning my property like she was inspecting it. Still, I brushed it off. I mean, we all do slightly odd things from time to time. Fast forward to that fateful morning. I had walked outside expecting to maybe rake some leaves, and instead found her white SUV not just in my driveway, but fully inside the garage. The audacity it took for someone to open my garage door, or force it open and park there. Shocking at first. I thought maybe she had some car trouble. Maybe she needed a place out of the weather. But it was not raining, and there was not any sign of urgency. No note, no apology. There was just her SUV. Quietly sitting in my spot, I circled the vehicle looking for any clue as to why did she think I was away. Admittedly, my side of the driveway is usually empty because my '92 pickup truck is out back near the garage, but that hardly constitutes an invitation. Feeling my blood pressure rise, I tried pressing the button on the wall to close the garage door. The mechanism whirred, but the sensor beeped. There was an obstacle. The SUV was parked crookedly in such a way that the back end blocked part of the frame. Great. I hopped up into my own garage, moved some of the mess around, tried pressing the door remote again. No dice. Then I noticed something else. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, perched on a passenger seat, was an empty Starbucks cup and a booklet on the back seat. A bright pink yoga mat. If I was reading the situation correctly, Karen was evidently out somewhere expecting to return to her newly claimed parking spot. I briefly considered being the bigger person by just letting it slide. Maybe leave a note on the windshield. Please do not park in my garage. But then I thought, no, this is outrageous. Who parks in another person's garage without notice, with zero consent? I had enough experience with teenagers sneaking off to smoke behind the school during my teaching days. But an adult pulling this? I was too old to let myself be a pushover. I phoned the local non-emergency police line. They asked, "Do you know the owner of the car?" I explained it was my new neighbor's. They told me they could send an officer out to file a report, but that it might be a civil matter since it is private property. I gave them my address, then waited outside, arms folded. 30 minutes ticked by. No police. Meanwhile, I saw a shadow marching down the sidewalk with that distinct ponytail bobbing. Sure enough, Karen herself, wearing pink spandex leggings and a frown. She marched right up to me. "What you doing near my car?" she snapped. I tried to keep composed. "Your car, Karen? This is my garage. You cannot just." She cut me off. "I need a place to park. The street was blocked, and my driveway is full of clutter right now from moving." I was momentarily stunned. The audacity of this woman was staggering. I began to say, "You did not ask me for permission," but she rolled her eyes. "Relax," she said. "I will be back soon, so keep your door open." Then she turned and strode away like I was a servant who had disappointed her. That is the moment the plan took root in my mind. If she thinks she can walk right into my garage, she has another thing coming. I watched her vanish around the bend and decided I had enough. Call me spiteful, but some lines should not be ignored. I walked over to the side of the garage. There was an old hasp where I used to lock up a spare bicycle with the chain in the corner. I had a brand new steel lock I had been saving to secure my storage shed. Without another second of hesitation, I put the hasp through the bracket, locked up tight from the inside, slid under the half-open door, and made sure no one was getting into that garage without the key. I took one last look at her SUV, realized how absurd the situation was, then quietly slipped out the side exit. This was only the beginning. If she wanted to treat my garage like a personal parking spot, I would show her what happens when you underestimate a retired teacher with too much time on his hands. While I waited for the police to arrive, I decided to calm my frustration. That old frustration and sense of outrage had me shaking a bit. I have never been one to pick fights, especially at my age, but I also was not about to let some selfish neighbor run all over me. I stepped back inside my house, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and tried to relax in my kitchen, listening for a knock at the door. Sure enough, an hour later, 2 officers arrived. Officer Brady and Officer Nolan. Familiar faces I had seen around town at various events knocked politely. I led them outside to the locked garage. I explained the situation, from how Karen had illegally parked to how she had walked away after telling me to keep the door open. The officers shook their heads. In a quiet, rural town like ours, it is not every day you get a complaint about someone's car inside somebody else's garage. Officer Brady said, "Mr. Gray, technically, you can have it towed. You could also request we speak to her and warn her of potential trespassing violations." I frowned, arms folded. Part of me liked the idea of removing her car out of there. Imagine her face when she came back. But I also knew that once she realized her SUV had been taken, she might become more hostile. The older I get, the less patience I have for those kinds of conflicts. Then another thought occurred to me, one that gave me a sly sense of satisfaction. "Officers, what happens if she complains that I locked her in?" Officer Nolan shrugged. "It is your property, so as long as there is no threat to her safety or the vehicle, you are within your rights. It is an odd situation, but if she parked illegally in your garage, that is on her." I nodded. "I will have you file a report, just in case, so there is a record of it. But for now I think I will keep it locked." Officer Brady gave me a knowing look, as though he understood I was not done being petty. They took some pictures, wrote up the document and left, leaving me alone with my locked garage and Karen's SUV trapped inside. Now, I was not planning to keep the car forever. I am not a criminal after all. My biggest goal was to teach Karen a lesson in respect. She had demanded my obedience, had expected me to submit to her, because it was convenient for her. Not once did she show any consideration or courtesy. So I sat on my porch for a while, waiting to see if she would return. An hour became 2, then 3. Eventually, the sun began to slip below the horizon, and there was still no sign of her. At that point, an idea formed in my head. Maybe I should head to my cabin at the lake for a while. A week away was something I had been meaning to do anyway. I have a little property up north, about a 2-hour drive, a quiet place for fishing and reading. The more I thought about it, the more amusing it became. She would come back, find my house locked up, the garage door locked from the inside, and no way to reach me. Sure, she might pound on the door or ring my bell, but I would not be home. Was it immature? Absolutely. But I figured I was not hurting her car, and I had every right to protect my own property. So on a whim, I packed up a small suitcase, grabbed my fishing gear, locked up the house, double-checked the garage was secured, and hopped in my old pickup. I left just after dusk, half expecting to see Karen come screeching into the driveway at the last moment. But no, the street was quiet except for a few insects and a hum of streetlights. I drove away with an odd mixture of excitement and nervousness swirling in my stomach. When I arrived at the cabin around 9 o'clock p.m., I immediately felt a sense of peace. Something about the stillness of the lake, the gentle rustle of tree branches. It is like nature reminding you that some things really do not matter all that much. My mind kept wandering to Karen, though I pictured her returning to find her SUV trapped away. Maybe she would call the police, but the cops would see the earlier report. They would know I did not steal her car. And if she truly wanted it back, well, she could call a locksmith or a tow truck and cover the bill. That was her problem, not mine. The next day, I went out to fish under a bright morning sky. I reeled in a couple of small trout, humming to myself, feeling more relaxed than I had in ages. Then my phone started buzzing. Caller ID unknown number. I had a sneaking suspicion it might be Karen, so I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call from a different, unknown caller. Again, I did not answer. After the third attempt, I decided to check the voicemail. Sure enough, it was Karen. She went from screeching hysteria in the first message to vaguely threatening in the second. Where are you? You cannot keep my car. I will have you arrested for theft, she shrieked. I replayed it and smirked in odd satisfaction. She was getting a taste of her own behavior for once. I spent the next couple of days completely disconnected from the chaos. No sense in feeding the fire by engaging. If she wanted her car, she could call the same police officers who had documented her trespassing. Meanwhile, I lounged on the deck, read old fishing magazines, grilled some fish, and turned off my phone except for an occasional peek just to see if I had any important messages. On day 3, a neighbor from back home, old Mrs. Cartwright, messaged me. She wrote, Desmond, that woman has been knocking on your door for hours. She has made a scene on the sidewalk. Police came by again, but left when she started shouting at them. Are you all right? I laughed at the mental image Karen raging on my front porch, seeing that the garage door was locked and my windows were dark. I responded to Mrs. Cartwright with a short explanation, then turned my phone off again. I was not about to end my little vacation just because Karen was having a breakdown. I reasoned that if her tantrum was that severe, she would have to solve it by calling a locksmith or paying to have the door forced open. But was she really going to break into my garage after illegally parking there in the first place? Time would tell, but I had 4 more days of relaxation on my schedule, and I was not going to waste any of them. I had a stack of puzzles, an old transistor radio, and a beautiful lake to gaze at. Karen's ridiculous tantrum would still be waiting when I got home. By midweek I had settled nicely into my routine at the cabin: wake up early, cook a hearty breakfast, fish for a few hours, then read or nap in the afternoons. It was perfect, if I am honest. A big part of the reason I was so content was the knowledge that I was no longer ignoring my own boundaries. For too long I had been too nice, letting people walk on me. But Karen was the final straw that made me stand up for myself in a decidedly unexpected way. I turned my phone off for nearly 2 days straight, only switching on occasionally to check for important messages. Each time I did, I saw a flood of missed calls and texts from unknown numbers. No doubt Karen had roped in her friends or family to bother me. A few were from neighbors, presumably curious about what was happening. One text, though, made me pause. It was from my old friend Sam, who lived a few houses down from me. You might want to know she has threatened legal action. Says she has got a lawyer. I told her good luck. Just thought you should be aware. Legal action over her illegally parking in my garage. The audacity of it made me laugh out loud. Still, I did not dismiss the possibility. People sue for just about anything these days. And yet, I had the police report on my side. It was all recorded. What could she accuse me of, exactly? Locking my own property? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how pointless her threats likely were. 2 more days passed without an incident, and I began to mentally prepare for heading home. Part of me was anxious about the confrontation that awaited me. Another part was genuinely curious to see how Karen would handle it if she had learned. Maybe she would realize that humbly Apologizing and asking for her car might actually get her somewhere. But after hearing her voicemails, I doubted that was in her plans. On Friday morning, packed up my fishing gear, tiddied the cabin, and got on the road. It was a clear, sunny day. The drive was peaceful. Twisting roads lined with tall pines, an explosion of red and orange leaves beneath, a bright blue sky. I had a moment of nostalgia for the days when life was easier, but I suppose things only feel simpler in hindsight. Even so, I did enjoy the humor of having left town and effectively taken a vacation to avoid drama that some folks would have handled right away. At my age, you learn to pick your battles. I pulled onto my street around noon, half expecting a crowd. Instead, everything looked normal, if somewhat quiet. As I drove past Karen's house, I noticed her driveway was still cluttered with half-unpacked boxes and random furniture. It seemed she was not a very organized person. At my house, there was no sign of police or anyone else. I parked in the driveway, jumped out, and walked up to the garage side door. The padlock was still in place, but the tension felt charged, like that quiet before a storm. Sure enough, as soon as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I heard an engine revving behind me. I turned and there was Karen in a smaller, older sedan, pulling into my driveway. She skidded to a stop and sprang out, ponytail bouncing. Well, look who decided to show up," she shouted, marching toward me. I refused to be shaken. "Hello, Karen. Did you miss me?" I said calmly, unlocking the secondary latch inside the garage. Her SUV was exactly where she had left it, covered in a thin layer of dust. "You think this is funny?" she hissed. "You stole my car. You locked it in here for days." I held in my laugh. "Karen, you parked in my garage without permission. I locked my own property. You could have called a tow truck or locksmith anytime you needed." She stared at me, mouth open, as if she could not believe I was not trembling in fear of her rage. I called the police. They said it is a civil matter, but you cannot keep someone's car trapped." I chuckled. "Prisoner, come on. You think that is the right word for something that was illegally on my property?" That remark seemed to anger her. She stomped her foot like a child. "You are going to regret this. My father is a lawyer. He will have you in court so fast your head will spin." I shrugged. "Great. Let us call him. I have a police report that says you trespassed. In fact, the officers documented your car in my garage. I do not think your father wants that fight." Karen's face reddened as she realized her threats held little power. She pivoted to a new excuse. "You owe me money for the trouble. I had to rent a car to get to work." This nearly made me laugh. "You parked illegally, got locked out, and somehow I owe you money? That is ridiculous math." She gritted her teeth, and for a second, I wondered if she might actually attack me instead. She turned, stormed over to her SUV, and tried to open the driver's door. It was locked. I held up the key I found inside the ignition after the police left. They had advised me to keep it secure or hand it to them. She glared, hand outstretched. "Give me my key?" I took a moment, savoring the furious look in her eyes. Finally, I waved it in front of her. "Promise me you will never park in my garage again." She let out a strangled snarl, but forced herself to nod. "Fine," she hissed. "Apologize," I added, wanting that final sense of justice. Her jaw tightened. "I am sorry." The tone was so insincere it might as well have been sarcasm, but at least it was a word she was not used to uttering. I tossed her the key, stepped aside, and watched as she unlocked her SUV, jumped in and revved the engine. She reversed out so fast, I half expected her to leave marks. As she turned the wheel, she shot me a deadly glare. "This is not over," she muttered through the window, then sped off toward her house. I exhaled, feeling a mixture of victory and lingering tension. She was gone, for now, at least. But something told me that our conflict had only just begun. Entitled people do not tend to understand lessons easily. But if she thought threats would change my stance, she was wrong. With Karen gone, closed up the garage door securely, and headed into my house. Everything looked the same as when I had left it. Plants drooping a bit, mail piled up, but no signs of a break-in or vandalism. I brewed a cup of tea, sat in my favorite recliner, and let out a slow, content sigh. Maybe Karen would give up, or maybe she would keep trying to escalate. Either way, I had enjoyed my peaceful week away, and I had zero regrets about how I had handled her brazen audacity. Life resumed in the cul-de-sac, though, with a new underlying tension. For the next several days, I noticed Karen staring at me whenever our paths crossed. She even went so far as to leave passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox. Parking hog. Old men should not start fights they cannot finish. And my personal favorite, you messed with the wrong one. Despite her theatrics, she never actually knocked on my door again, or attempted to park in my garage a second time. I suspected she wanted to keep her distance since the police already had a record of her trespassing, but that did not stop her from shouting remarks whenever she caught me raking leaves or taking out the trash. I learned to shrug it off. Retirement does wonders for your perspective on nonsense. Meanwhile, word spread around the neighborhood about our little garage incident. Some neighbors thought I was a local hero, offering me knowing smiles and quiet high fives for standing up to her. Others, especially the younger families, kept their space, not wanting to get caught in the feud. If there is one thing that can turn a quiet street into a battleground, it is a neighbor feud. One day, as I was tidying up my front yard, Mr. Goldstein from across the way strolled over. He was in his 70s once, an avid birdwatcher with a sharp sense of humor. "Heard you taught that woman a lesson," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "She parked in my garage. Without permission I locked it. Then I took a break." He let out a hearty laugh, wiping tears from his eyes. I only wish I had seen her face when she realized her car was locked in. "Good on you, Desmond. Do not let her intimidate you." I smiled. "I appreciate that, Mr. Goldstein." It felt nice to have the support of at least some neighbors, especially the ones close to my age. These days, it is easy to feel ignored or disregarded when you are older, so unity goes a long way. A week later, received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside a single sheet of cheap paper with a short typed sentence in bold, "Thought you were going to pay." The words dripped with rage and implied threat. My gut told me Karen was behind it, but it could have been someone else, an associate, or a relative of hers. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part thought it wise to file a police complaint, given the possibility of harassment. So I walked down to the local station, showed them the letter, and filled out a report. They could not do much with no return address, but at least there was a record. Over the next few days, nothing serious happened. I began to think maybe Karen was all talk, no bite. But then, on a Sunday morning, something shifted. I woke up early, as always, and stepped onto my porch to collect the paper. There, on my front lawn, was a scattering of garbage. Banana peels, coffee grounds, eggshells, as if someone had emptied a trash can right there. My immediate thought, Karen. I gathered up the mess and placed it into a plastic bag to dispose of it. Then I checked my security camera. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., a hooded figure sneaked onto my lawn, dumped a garbage bag, and ran off. The footage was blurry, but I was nearly certain it was Karen's build. Armed with this evidence, I could have called the police again, but I paused. Did I really want this dispute to escalate further? In my younger years, I might have been less careful, but I am old enough to know that these small acts of pettiness can spiral into something truly nasty. Perhaps it was time to try a more direct approach instead of calling the cops. I marched down to Karen's house. She answered the door, wearing her typical bothered expression. The moment she saw me, she tried to slam the door in my face, but I stuck my foot in. "We need to talk," I said firmly. She folded her arms. "Go away. I have security footage of you throwing trash in my yard. Next time I will show the cops. We both know they already think you are trouble, and you might end up with charges that actually stick. Is that what you want?" Her eyes flashed. "You locked my car up like it with some stolen trash? Maybe you deserve a little revenge." "Karen, this has to stop," I said, trying to maintain a calm voice. "You are the one who started this by parking in my garage. You could have apologized genuinely. You could have asked for help with your space issues. Instead, You threatened me. You defiled my property with your waste. Is this how you really want to exist? She flinched like my words struck a nerve. Then her face hardened again. You embarrassed me. Ah, there it was. The real root of her anger. She was not used to being challenged or outmaneuvered. You shamed yourself by acting self-important, I replied softly. I am willing to let the garbage stunt slide if you just leave me be, but if you continue, I will press charges. I have every right to defend my property and my peace of mind. For a moment, we locked eyes. In that flicker of quiet, I saw something change in her expression, like she finally understood that I was serious, that I would not be easily pushed, and that she would only make things worse by continuing the battle. She let out a slow breath. Fine, she said. If you keep that evidence to yourself, I will stay away from your home. I nodded. Deal. Then I turned and walked off her porch. I like to say that was the end of it, that Karen had an awakening and changed her ways. But people are not that simple, and old behaviors die hard. However, from that day forward, she ignored me altogether. No more notes in the mailbox. No more trash on my lawn. No more insults from across the street. She never apologized again, but at least she respected my boundaries. As for me, I felt a sense of victory, but more than that, relief. Sometimes the best revenge is not dramatic. Sometimes the biggest win is simply reclaiming your sanity without descending into madness. Karen learned the hard way that not everyone will bow to her demands. And I learned at 62 that it is never too late to stand your ground and protect what is yours.